Welcome back to the Exponential Athlete Podcast. This is the third and final segment of my three-part series on Kobe Bryant, the anatomy of his excellence. So this part is focusing specifically on outside factors related to Kobe Bryant's success. So who his parents were, his genetics, some of the lucky things that happened over the course of his career. And we're also going to touch on, towards the end of this segment, some of the consequences of his approach or his success. So we're not just here to celebrate Kobe. We also want to see what he could have potentially done better or what didn't go as well as planned. So that is really what we're going to focus on here. If you recall, in the last two sections, we first focused on how Kobe learns and his philosophy around that, and then what goes on inside of his mind. This is a little bit different. This is a little bit more biographical, but I think it also paints a really good picture about what constructs in our life can shape who we become as an athlete or as an entrepreneur or any of these different domains. So I want to kick this off thinking about what we can control and what we can't control. So there's a lot of things we generally can't control. We can't control how tall we are, how much fast twitch muscle fiber and those types of things we have. But within that construct, we can look at what our limitations are and try to supplement them in different ways. So I want to start this episode out by focusing on Kobe's genetics. So Kobe had some pretty major advantages when it comes to genetics. His dad was an incredible athlete. He had this passed down to him through essentially encoded genetic material. And this is a little example of how gifted his father was. Joe, who was Kobe's dad, ran the mile in 4 minutes, 45 seconds, and the 80 meters in 2 minutes, 1 second. Long jump, 19 feet, and triple jumped 39 feet, 9 inches for Bartram's track team. Joe was so damned athletic and looked so good being so damn athletic, liquid, no jagged edges to his game, always playing at his own pace. A zoot sweet dance slowed down until it was a ballet. That the other guys at the playgrounds gave him the nickname born of the old Glenn Miller tune, a big band song title shortened to slang. Gotta be jelly, because jam don't shake. So Kobe was unbelievably physically gifted, passed down from his dad. But some would argue that he wasn't quite as athletic as his dad was. So Kobe was 6'6". His dad was 6'9". He liked to joke that his dad stole some of his extra height. Kobe did have other advantages. He had a massive wingspan. When he was getting measured for a suit jacket when he was making his announcement to declare for the NBA draft, the tailor said that his wingspan was 7'2", which is massive. There was some pretty good research done a while ago that wingspan for NBA players was very indicative of performance. So it doesn't necessarily matter how tall you are. It matters how high you can reach up. So if your wingspan is larger, your effective height is greater in the NBA. So this is something that was an advantage for him. Still, Kobe didn't necessarily have all the physical advantages. His hand size, for example, was not that big compared to a lot of the other great players. So Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, they all had massive hands compared to Kobe. And yes, his were basically baseline or generally average, but he viewed this as a weakness. And he worked tirelessly to strengthen his hands, to turn that weakness of having relatively small hands compared to the other greats into a strength. So he could palm the basketball still, even with relatively small hands. He had this whole finger stretching and strength routine that he would do. So even if we aren't necessarily given all the physical gifts, there are ways that we can supplement these. There's a way that we can work around these. We also talked a little bit about how Kobe perhaps didn't get as much sleep because he was working so hard. And that was one of the things that he sacrificed. This could have been a factor in him not growing as tall as he could have gotten. So he declared for the draft when he was 17 years old. He played in the NBA while he, in theory, should or could still have been growing all the way up to 23, 24, 25. So him getting in those extra practice hours could have taken away from the potential physical baseline that he would have gotten. And because of Kobe's genetics, because he didn't get to be as tall as he thought he might have, he did also kind of have to change how he played the game that he could have envisioned. So growing up, I mentioned this in the last episode, he really worshipped Magic Johnson. He loved that style of play. But when he realized he wasn't going to be as big as Magic Johnson, he started to shift towards replicating a lot of Michael Jordan's style of play because they were very similar in size and stature. Now I want to take a second to talk about his dad, Joe Bryant. So we obviously talked about the physical side of what he got from his dad, but there's plenty of other things that he got from having a dad as a mentor who had these experiences in pro ball that I really want to focus on. So it's obvious Joe Bryant, he played in the NBA, I believe it was for 10 seasons, and then he played in Italy for the remainder of his career. And he was an okay NBA player. He was an unbelievable college player, but that didn't necessarily translate to the league in the same way. There was a lot more constraints. There was a lot more, hey, you can't do this. You have to play in a certain style. And then when he went back to Europe, he was able to play the type of ball that he excelled in the most. But it's very interesting to see how Kobe was able to develop having his dad as a mentor, someone who really knew the ropes and could guide him in the correct way when he was young. Here's an example of sort of the basketball skill that was passed down from his dad. He was being taught, groomed at an early age to be the player he eventually became. His dad was one of the greatest players in the city of Philadelphia. His uncle was one of the greatest players in the city of Philadelphia. You look at his pedigree and his genes on both sides, and a lot of who Kobe was genetic. But the mindset he had to watch and learn and perfect certain things was off the charts. Unbelievable. So I forgot to mention, and we'll talk about his mom in a little bit, his mother also had good basketball genes on her side via her brother. So there's a whole lot of pedigree that's passed down. But again, they talk about physical pedigree that's passed down. There's also educational and knowledge that's passed down over time. So Joe, sitting next to him, watching the tapes with him, delivering analysis and commentary, explaining to Kobe what was about to happen, what this player or that player was about to do and why. And Kobe couldn't get enough. See where Olajuwon sets up in the post. It gives him enough leverage and room to spin to the baseline if he wants. So he has a private tutor. He has someone that has all of the answers around basketball that he can constantly ask and watch. And his dad has this basketball nuance that he can pass down to his son who's completely immersed. Unfortunately, I think most of us don't have a parent or someone that's close to us that can provide that exact type of mentorship. But ourselves, we can read, we can listen to podcasts like this. We can find a lot of these different resources where we can hopefully get that type of knowledge. And it might benefit us even more if we're individually curious and we figure out things ourselves. Some of that learning is a meta skill that could carry us even a little bit further. Kobe also learned to enjoy the game from his dad. He says it about him, he just played with so much charisma. He taught me to enjoy the game. I guess I kind of just said that, but to me, there's something special about that. If he saw joy in his dad playing the sport, he saw what was possible from a fun perspective. It brought him even further to the game. And we talked about in the first part about Kobe's love of the game. I think that that's where this really started. We can find ways to love the game. I don't think we need a parent that absolutely loves the game, but that can really help. You look at the case of Tiger Woods, you look at some of these other things. There's a lot of opportunities for us as parents or mentors to exhibit that same type of love and pass that on. Something that also is a huge factor for his dad is he'd get to play against his dad all the time. They'd be in the driveway. They'd be able to have this competitive fire that goes back and forth. And how often do people have, a competitive person in their life that is essentially always on demand? I've seen some research where, for example, brothers or a second child, the younger brother, is usually a better athlete or a very effective athlete because they're always playing against a better competition. They always have someone to test their skills against. In jiu-jitsu, there's two brothers. I think they're 19 or 20. They're the Rotolo twins. And they've always had a training partner their entire life. How lucky are they to be able to continually butt heads and improve their skills against each other? That to me is something that, if you have friends nearby, if you can figure out how to have a competitor or training partner nearby, that's unbelievably valuable. And as a parent, that's one of the best things you can do. Though Joe offered Kobe videos of his own younger days, Kobe didn't need them. He had the real thing to measure himself against. Joe would play one-on-one with him when available, but with so many hours a day in Italy dedicated to professional practice, it wasn't humanly possible for his father to play enough to slack Kobe's thirst. So right there, I mean, yes, Kobe does have his dad who was able to play basketball with him for a good portion of the day. He's also able to go on these trips, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. What is the impact of being around professional basketball for Kobe? So, not only was Joe Bryant a competitor to Kobe, but he was also a companion. Throughout the entire experience, Joe was his companion and guide. The disappointment of his own career had committed Joe to making sure that his son avoided the same fate. Yet as much as Joe wanted a son who would be great, it was Kobe's internal motivation that drove the machine. So Joe had an understanding of the pitfalls in his career, and he could start guiding Kobe away from the things that didn't work for him. So he had this extra data point that was very valuable. And then finally, we touched on it a little bit earlier with the opportunity for Kobe to play continually against his dad, to play pickup, to practice like this. But there's also some element of scientific discovery. Their driveway on Remington Road was their private laboratory. Through the summer, Kobe had added 2 inches and was now 6'5". He had put on muscle, some of it born of natural prepubescent testosterone, some of it from intermittent weight training at Lower Merion and at the Jewish Community Center. There was only one true way in his mind to test his physical improvement: play dad one-on-one. So he had this constant measure, this benchmark that he was always trying to beat in his father. And that carried him through a lot of his early high school career. He eventually was able to beat his dad, and that was a very important day for him. But this, his dad is able to give him the type of looks that would give him confidence, but not necessarily make him overconfident. He was able to give exact feedback, and you can really only get that from people who are generally better than you at a certain point in time. So here's the impact that being around professional basketball had on Kobe. He wasn't afraid. That was what people didn't realize. The great players are able to play where their confidence doesn't vary. What distinguishes a great player sometimes is his level of confidence. You can be put in a negative situation that will damage your psyche, and you'd shy away from the things you'd normally do. Kobe never had that problem. His dad was the same way. Never shot a bad shot. If he missed 10, he might make the next 10. I'm sure being around the pros reinforced that for Kobe. So from an early age, from when he was 8 years old, he was the ball boy. He was cleaning the courts for these teams. He was going to practice with his dad. He was seeing how professional athletes behave. He was able to realize at an early age that he was working harder than them. He was putting in more effort. He could match up and see, what skills am I deficient in compared to these players? What skills am I on par with next to these players? And use that as a measuring stick. A lot of us idolize, worship these professional athletes, and when you see them play, it seems completely mystical. But a lot of the times, if we look at it objectively, yes, there's a massive gap between what they do and what we do, but some areas are closer than we think. And if we're an elite athlete, we're a Division I athlete, there might even be some areas where you're at the professional level already, but there are other areas you need to work to improve and to adjust. So it takes being around these people when they practice, when they play, and having those opportunities that he was granted through his father. The last thing that really helped Kobe from his dad was the connections he made. So being a former NBA player, playing in Italy, doing all these things, his dad had really good connections. And one of the ways that Kobe was able to get into some of the important basketball camps was through his dad's connection. So one really important connection, which led to a lot of financial upside, was his connection to Sonny Vaccaro. So Sonny was an executive at Adidas. He's the one, when he was at Nike, who signed Michael Jordan, and they were able to make this connection. They were able to make this shoe deal where Kobe was making a ton of money if he just declared for the NBA draft. So he hedged his risk of going to the NBA by having a shoe deal available. So Sonny V gave me my first opportunity. He gave me my first opportunity to go to a camp to show my skills as a basketball player. I love that guy. He's so open. He loves the game. More important, he loves kids. He loves giving them the opportunity to showcase their skills. He's great, a wonderful man. So Kobe, yes, Sonny Vaccaro did give him this opportunity, but it was via Kobe's dad, right? So I think it's important to look at that relationship. It probably wouldn't have happened. Maybe he still would have gone to these camps, but it would have happened a year later. He would have gotten less recognition. Maybe he would have ended up having to go to college, or even wanting to go to college, if some of that infrastructure wasn't in place. His next part is called Room to Grow. So this is how they designed Kobe's childhood, his early career in middle school and high school to form him into a great basketball player. I think this was a design by both of his parents to give him exactly what he needed as he was growing up. So in part one, in terms of learning, we talked about how Kobe had this progressive schedule of he was playing in a bunch of these different leagues, and not all of the leagues were the same difficulty. In some of the leagues, he was able to work on his skills, and others, he was able to play against fierce competition. What I didn't necessarily describe is that was by design by his dad and by his parents. His dad wanted him to have a proving ground for his skills and then competition that would allow him to test those in more uncertain circumstances. Bryant could have played with many better-known AAU teams, Rines explained, who was the coach. But he preferred Rines' lesser-known, less ambitious team because he could dominate the roster and be its featured player. So this was front of mind when Kobe was approaching high schools, when Kobe was approaching AAU teams, especially early in his high school career and late in his middle school career. His dad wanted to have him be the man to be able to get the reps, but also to dominate the team. Before Kobe could begin with Ryan's team, Joe had to make sure that Kobe would be the man. In one sense, the status could be measured simply by the number of shots he could take in an hour-long AAU game. The more shots, the better the opportunity. So again, this is Joe Bryant identifying that and setting that up. Kobe had to have the 15 extra shots to develop. The coaches and the other players would have to understand that Kobe was the top of the team's hierarchy. So do you think that this opportunity to take all these extra shots would be allotted to just any old player? I would imagine that Joe Bryant had something to do with getting the sign off or allowing, or the coaches allowing Kobe to have an opportunity to get all these extra reps in. People would say he would have made out better playing with a better AAU team. He made out better with us because he made himself a star. He took on other teams that maybe had 4 or 5 Division I players, and he just controlled the whole game. So he learned the skill of controlling the whole game. He learned the skill of leading a team of lesser players early on. And that's not something he could have necessarily learned if he was playing on teams with equal talent all the way across. Some would say that hurt him later in his career when he's in the NBA and he's around talented all-stars, another massive talent and, generational player like Shaq. But in the interim, this was the best way for him to be able to develop a skill set of leadership, but as well as work on the areas of his game. He also was considered very selfish, but this was by design. So he went through a stage of being totally, totally selfish. Then he went through a stage of learning how to dribble and cross over to the point where he would kick the ball out of bounds 8 times, 7 times in a row, just trying to pick up a move. How can you coach that? If he's trying to pick up something and that's what he wanted to do, then he would do it. Finally, I was like, what the fuck? Can we win the game? Let's win the game, and you can work on whatever move you want. Because the next thing you know, we're down 12, 14, 16 points with him trying to work on a crossover move discreetly. So Kobe cared about winning, without a doubt, but that was later in his career. Kobe, during the first arc, before he got to high school ball and AAU ball and tournament ball, he cared about improving his skills. And I don't think a lot of people are allotted the ability to work on so many things in game scenarios as he was because of the structure his parents set up. He also, it was very clear that he didn't care about winning to begin with. Here's an example of that. I'll give Kobe credit. He didn't give a fuck about winning. He cared only about his own personal progress, his own personal accomplishments. So that is a very individualistic approach and individualistic attitude, but the environment that was created for him allowed him to do that. I don't think that that's something that's allotted to the average player, anyone that really, laces up and goes on the court. That's not something that is that is even accessible because you have teammates. You don't want to look like an asshole. You want to get playing time. A lot of us are competing for those things, and Kobe never had to worry about that. But he did set up for different levels of competition. So in these early stages, he was able to work on things, but he was also he had to get reps against good players or else he would stay stagnant. He said, I enjoy playing against great competition. That's how you get better. I knew that. Playing it for Lower Merion, I knew I'd be facing the best players from the suburban area. I knew that the Sunny Hill League would give me a chance to face the top players from the city, and ABCD All-American Camp put me up against the best players in the country. He's very clearly articulating the levels of competition that he had and how he had to compete against them. During days that stretched from early morning to 9 at night and beyond, he played 6 different leagues and attended 2 summer camps. Just like we described before, he's getting all these reps in with this varying competition. But this is another thing that he was allotted that most people wouldn't. The financial burden of playing on all these teams and going to these camps was probably inaccessible for most people. For better or for worse, having finances and having a bankroll is something that is a competitive advantage. This is something that some of us have, some other of us don't have, but it is a factor in sports performance. You look, for example, at Tiger Woods, who I'll be doing in the next series. He came up with dramatically less income and less opportunities. His parents really had to sacrifice to get him those opportunities. But he was able to get them through, his dad being very resourceful. And, who knows how good he could have been if he had access to better training resources, these types of things early on. And this is just to show how things change over time for him. So just as Bryant had once opted for an AAU team with less talent and a high school team with less talent to give him room to play and grow, he now seemed intent on leading the Lakers team with less talent. This is after Shaq had left. And so he felt a lot more at home in those years because he was leading the team, dominating the team, leading by example. He obviously wanted to play with good players, but it felt more like home for him in the league when there wasn't another massive talent. And I think other players coming in, that when they won the second 2 championships, the level of talent dramatically improved. The type of player that was dedicated, that wanted to play with a guy like Kobe, also sort of self-selected. And again, I attribute a lot of that success to Pau Gasol, who fit into that system, who let Kobe be a leader and was able to make this all work out. So next, I want to talk about Kobe's mom. I think she's a very important part of the story. So we touched on her a little bit. So she's someone that definitely gave structure to his life. People describe her as constantly doting on him. So she made it so in his life, he needed to focus on nothing but basketball and schoolwork. Those are the things she cared about. And, he wouldn't have to worry about food. He wouldn't have to worry about laundry. Wouldn't have to worry about anything aside from those specific things. That's very fortunate for him. I don't think many of us are lucky or necessarily would even want to have that much structure imposed on us in our lives. But this definitely helped him find that creativity and that structure when he was just had to focus on this very limited set of things. She also was known for having this streak of perfectionism. And they say that this is one of the things that made Kobe work so hard in practice. He never wanted to lose a single drill. And in high school, when he did lose a drill for the first time, he freaked out. The guy, it's like a little guy who caused him to lose the drill. It was a team drill. He chased him around the court, and the kid was like, I don't know if he's going to punch me, what's going to go on. He was just pissed for an entire afternoon. And, maybe that's not necessarily a good thing, but maybe that competitive fire that he got from his mom is something that really drives him in an effective way. This is a little bit more on that sense of structure I described. Schaefer would usually create an optimum program in terms of diet, strength training, conditioning, and recovery, with hopes that a player might follow 50% of it. So Schaefer was one of the strength coaches. Nobody could achieve 100% of such programs Schaefer offered, but Bryant was the one athlete who actually got close, both during season and off. I think that this commitment and ability to stick to structure is something that he inherited from his mom. This is something that he got. I mean, his father was very focused on free-flowing, inspired play, and he was known for improvising. That's the word. And his mom was quite the opposite. The last thing that Kobe is said to have inherited from his mom is what he would describe as the killer instinct. Tex Winter, the veteran coach who worked so closely with both Jordan and Bryant, would often say it was chief among the many fundamental traits the two superstars shared was their intense perfectionism. In terms of Bryant's achievement, it's fair to say, in so many ways, the mother had made the man. So it was that, and also sort of embracing the dark side of what we described before. From the enthusiasm aspect, his love to play, I'm more like my father, Bryant said in 1999, but on the court, I'm more like my mother. Very interesting to see those things. I mean, his dad was the actual basketball player. You'd think that Kobe was like his dad on the court, but no, he took after his mother in the perfectionist tendencies, the dedication, the focus, and also sort of that forceful, I wouldn't say negative, but sort of dark energy. Something that was relatively unique to Kobe in terms of a player that played majoritively in the US was his experience living in Italy. And I think that this really sets him apart. But I also think that this is a little bit more actionable for a lot of us compared to, for example, genetics and things along those lines. So growing up, Kobe talks a lot about how he got the fundamentals of basketball from playing in Italy. In the US, when he's talking about his kids, he says they're not teaching the fundamentals. They're teaching them all these crazy dribbling things. They're teaching them stuff that won't actually make them better at basketball. He stresses that his experience in Italy really ingrained what mattered more than anything else. And I want to touch on that just a little bit more, which was great because I learned the fundamentals first. So this is him talking about being in Italy. I think most kids grow up here in America, learn all the fancy dribbling. In Italy, they teach you true fundamentals and leave out all the nonsense. During my early years in the NBA, I was surprised to learn that I took a different, more fundamental approach to footwork than a lot of players. A lot of players are solely focused on improving off the dribble, but I also placed added emphasis on playing off the catch. I learned that approach when I was young in Europe. There, our practices included scrimmages where we weren't allowed to dribble. So having a different view of how basketball is taught lets him contrast that to what he's doing in the US. There's a benefit of traveling and going to see how other people play your sport all over the world. Even regionally, there's differences. Again, don't like to compare myself to Kobe, but I have this experience when I go train jiu-jitsu at different schools. They teach it fundamentally different. The basics are taught fundamentally different. And whenever I go somewhere else, I can compare that to what I'm learning at home. And I can say, hey, maybe this other way is a little bit better. I can ask, and I have some context to compare against. In this case, Kobe found that the fundamentals are something that he really relishes, and everything else is based off that. And he's able to create an advantage just from this breadth of opinion. I think Kobe also, from growing up in Italy, had an opportunity to introspect a little bit more and become more imaginative than a lot of these other kids. I talked in the last episode about how he was moving constantly, basically every 2 years. He didn't speak the language in the early days, and he had to pick up these skills. So he had to learn the adaptability. He had to learn to open his mind to learning new things that were relatively difficult for a kid that age. And of course, they paid dividends in the long run. Something I think that's interesting is basketball was the only constant between these things. His love of practice, his skill associated with that. He found, I believe he used basketball somewhat as a coping mechanism. So basketball was a safe place. He could always go and practice, and that would be the same everywhere that he went. That probably is something that really endeared basketball to him. It was the one constant, it was the one thing that he could go to feel safe. And you see that, I think, as well with Tiger Woods and some of these other athletes. A lot of their love for the sport comes because they feel most at home when they are playing the sport. And that to me is something, I mean, I'll probably have to talk to a psychologist to figure out how you can create that feeling as much as possible. But, if you're not at home when you're playing your sport, if you don't feel you're most comfortable, like in your natural environment, that is something you really want to strive for. There's some other elements of this as well. He said he first realized that he could take over a game by himself when he was very young, 9 or 10, playing little leagues. When the game is on the line and you're put in the situation and your back's against the wall, you come out fighting. He was fighting. It was a fight or flight mentality, and he's always been a fighter. So I don't know if this was unique to Italy or some of these other things, but that he developed that early in his life in Italy as well. And then the last thing that he developed in Italy, which I think is also fairly unique to him, was his passion for the game. And if you go to a soccer game, you go to any sporting event in Europe, it is vastly different and way less tame than in the United States. The people are crazy. The fans are yelling. Everyone is like manic in these stadiums. And you don't realize how passionate they are about sports until you go and experience it. Years later, former Lakers teammate Metta World Peace would play his first Italian league game before the lively, passionate crowd in Pistola, and immediately afterward would phone Kobe and tell him, "Okay, I know why you play the way you do." To me, you understand that once you've gone, but to play in the US and exclusively play in the US, it just isn't the same. The feeling, the passion, the energy that everyone shares in those moments is unbelievable. Fans in America are not even close to their passion for the game. Leon Douglas said of Pistola. So the experience of Italy, being able to share the love of basketball with so many people in this closed environment with these players, is something that Kobe really took with him throughout his career. The last part related to Kobe's environment is luck and timing. These are things that are part of all of our lives. These are things that, again, we don't necessarily have control over. But one of my favorite quotes related to sports and luck is by Gary Player, and he says the more he practices, the luckier he gets. So you create a lot more surface area for luck over time, the better you are and the more you practice. But fortunate things do happen in careers, and I think that some of these things are good, and there are obviously some bad breaks as well. Something that I really like that is a little bit luck and a little bit of design is that Kobe's introduction to Tex Winter, as well as playing in the triangle offense. I think the triangle offense is something that worked well for him. It's something he studied aggressively over time. And it was a little bit fortuitous that Phil Jackson and Tex Winter did end up coming to coach the Lakers when they did. Kobe fit into that system really well, and they were able to win and succeed in that system. I also think that the triangle offense fit particularly well when Pau was introduced to it. And it was fortuitous that they would trade for Pau Gasol, who, again, I believe was instrumental in those last two Lakers championships. So all of these things, again, a little bit of luck, a little bit of interest in Kobe, and he might have had some influence on those things. But there's little things like this that add up over time. I think fortuitousness happens with, there's a lot of luck involved with almost every professional athlete. Maybe Kobe would have had 3 less championships or something if there wasn't some luck involved, or he could have had more. That is a normal distribution. It's not something we can account for. But when we do get lucky or something good happens for us, we should just be grateful for it whenever we can. So this last and final part is the cautionary tale. So with Kobe's approach, again, he was one of the greatest athletes of all time. He obviously, I probably should mention from a luck perspective, he probably had the worst streak of luck towards the end of his career and his eventual death in the plane crash. And that's something no one could have accounted for, and it's unbelievably tragic. But that is the reality of how things turned out. But from a cautionary tale perspective, I think it's important to understand what the consequences of greatness are, and to see if we can avoid some of the pitfalls that maybe Kobe fell into. So Kobe's greatness was something that I believe made him very misunderstood. People thought that he was so arrogant. People thought that things wouldn't work out for him because he could cut people off or do some of these things. But a lot of those are a function of the hard work he put in behind the scenes and his unwillingness to compromise on anything other than greatness. I think that's what turns a lot of people off about him, because they don't understand that to be the very best, you have to do things that are not going to make you a likable person. You have to sacrifice tons of things. People might think you're arrogant, but you're just focused. Like, there's that line between him and everyone else. Like, people always ask, what was he like in high school? Was he an asshole? Was he this? No, he just knew what he wanted to do at an early age. So he's not going to go hang out with as many people. He's not going to go do what a lot of kids would consider fun, because for him, it wasn't fun. He wasn't antisocial. He was just driven towards a specific goal. Kobe had a lot to learn about interacting with other people. He really hadn't been a student of human nature as much as he had been a student of basketball. So, he didn't always do the right thing as far as his teammates. He had that young and stubborn swagger about him. He was going to do what he thought was best, what he thought he should do, regardless of anyone else. So he was so focused on basketball, where many other kids might be focusing on just trying to make friends and develop those social interpersonal skills. That wasn't of interest to him because he didn't believe at the time it would make him good at basketball. So it wasn't necessarily that he was mean or not a good person. It was that he was just indexing differently than other people. Kobe was also just fundamentally different from other people, and that could cause friction between teammates or anyone else. This cat talks 7 languages. He didn't live through the same shit we did. He knows what to order when we go to a Chinese restaurant. Like, he really knows. Just a high level of intelligence that he had because of this world that they didn't necessarily have because of where they came from. They weren't dogging him or anything. It's just like, this cat is different. So Kobe is just so fundamentally different than, for example, the players he played with in the NBA, that he was difficult to understand. He had this complexity. He had this air of worldliness that other people did not have exposure to. And it's really easy to distrust or dislike or distance yourself from people that you don't believe you have anything in common with. One story that I really liked that sort of showed me the difference between Kobe and other NBA players was that when Tex Winter and Phil Jackson took over and they're learning the triangle offense, Kobe is baffled that other people aren't familiar with it and can't pick it up easily, because that is what he lived through his childhood, through watching Jordan play and all of these things. Kobe had a great line, Schaefer said. He's like, did any of you guys get TNT? Because, the Bulls were on TV so much. It's like he knew already. He had completely mastered it. Before the first practice he knew. He certainly knew the right spots on the floor. He knew the right actions. He knew what he wanted to get out of it. It was amazing. So Kobe is studying the triangle offense way before Tex Winter gets there. He's studying these things, and he's assuming that everyone else is studying these things too. They want to be great basketball players. They are great basketball players, but they're not studying this. That does not match up to him. It baffles him that other people are not viewing it in the same way. And I think that that's something that causes a lot of dissonance for him over time. Kobe just resented the hell out of that because he looked at Shaq and he went, this guy doesn't work as hard as I do. He's not in shape. He's a goofball. He's a clown. And I'm working my ass off. And I'm supposed to take the backseat to him. It's one of those things where I think at a more mature age, maybe he would have been able to deal with it in a different fashion, but maybe not. I think we all have a sense of justice. We all feel that we want to be rewarded. And when we see that somebody who doesn't work as hard is given higher status, I think it rubs us all the wrong way. It's just a matter of how we deal with it. So this is the origin or the seed that plants this disconnect with Shaq over time, is that Kobe is constantly putting in the work. Kobe is treating this mission or this quest as the main thing in his life that brings him value. And Shaq doesn't view it the same way. And so it's hard for Kobe, going the other direction, to empathize and relate to other people that fundamentally see things a different way. And it wasn't just that Kobe wasn't on the same page with other people. He was just so different and misunderstood. He also was in this scenario where he would overshadow his teammates quite a bit. And that's something that he didn't really have control over. It was more of an other people's ego issue, which is a little bit hard to deal with. This is just something that is an inevitability of why people get turned off by others that are more talented or just better overall than they are. The circumstances were a perfect recipe for problems between young Bryant and his older teammates, the same problems that he had faced in Italy that he would later face in the NBA. As time went on, the alpha kicked in. Downer, who was his high school coach, he admitted of Bryant's dominating personality. But the obvious point for any coach in such circumstances was that Bryant's presence also made things easier. The easier stuff was the work ethic and his sponge-like mentality to be the best that he could be and to absorb information. I always thought that his brain was a sponge. And obviously, if you coached, you know that you can't say this about all your players. You tell Kobe something once, you don't have to say it again. Like it's there. Kobe changed things in the sense that we now had a centerpiece, but it wasn't like he was surrounded. So Kobe's going there, picking up things quickly, and everyone else is struggling. And imagine how frustrating that might be, where you need to be told something 2 or 3 times. You're embarrassed to ask questions because I think everyone's been in that, where you're in class and someone just picks it up immediately and it's so frustrating because you don't quite get it, but you don't want to look stupid in front of other people. And it's very easy to empathize with the people who are not Kobe in this circumstance, who need to see it again and need to understand. I've been in that situation in classrooms all the time, and it is such a struggle. Kobe also was forced into interesting positions when he was the best player on these teams, or when he was overshadowing his opponents, or even his teammates. He was kind of forced to practice skills that he would only need if he was the guy on the court. So Card always wondered why Bryant practiced the most difficult shots over and over again. In games with double and triple teams around him, he would pass to an open teammate only to see them often miss shots. At some point, if his team was going to win, Bryant knew he would have to make those shots against multiple defenders. He knew there would be times in a game, even though he saw guys open, where he had to create a shot for himself. The way he practiced, he was being innovative and creative and just had a mentality that he could get it done. So one of the problems is that Kobe didn't feel like he could trust his teammates to execute when they needed to execute. And, that's one element of this overarching theme of Kobe outshining his teammates. But if he wants to win, if he wants to excel, sometimes he had to take it on himself. And that isn't necessarily taken in the best way by those around him. He had a greater store of naivete to deplete before the cynicism set in. In some ways, that was what his older teammates resented most about him. The sway of brilliant youth he had over them. The sheer fucking audacity of it. They may have had their college, but he had magic, and he had magic around him that they could never have. So this is when he's first getting into the NBA, and he has this unbelievable ability to play with these people that are that much older than he is. He didn't have to go to college, and he could still compete. And that's something that none of these other players could have. There's always going to be that gap, that air that he is, quote unquote, better than them in that way. Kobe was extremely hard on players who didn't live up to his expectations. If Kobe imagined one way for Karl to play and Karl did not live up to that, then for Kobe, he was of no use after that. So this hard standard, and this is something Kobe imposed, was how he viewed the world. It was black and white. You either work hard or you don't, and you're either on my side or you're not on my side. Winter had long observed that both Jordan and Bryant, because of their incredible ability and ruthless competitive natures, were not entirely popular with their teammates. Michael, though, was a lot harder on his teammates than Kobe, Winter offered. Michael would come down really hard on them at times. So it's interesting to compare Kobe to Michael Jordan. Kobe, I think, just anecdotally, had a lot more criticism of how he led and how he was with his teammates compared to Michael. But Michael and him exhibited quite a lot of those things. Text Winner here even says that he was harder on his teammates than Kobe was. The next part of the downside of success or the downside of Kobe's approach, so not only being isolated from teammates, but he also distanced himself from his family and friends. So he believed that he had to have this singular focus, and he was willing to compartmentalize and cut off people from his life in order to do that. On the other hand, that can make him very lonely. I don't know if he would explicitly say that. He did have a good family life. That was one area where he really did carve out time to be able to make time for his kids and for his wife. But there was a downside in terms of social connections, friends, and family. Bryant clearly wanted the space to find his own independent adult life, but he admitted that his dedication to the game required so much, it was difficult to pursue relationships with either friends or lovers. So again, he eventually does find Vanessa, his future wife, and they were married for quite a long period of time. But friends and these other things, he didn't socialize with other players. He didn't have those types of connections, and that is something that I believe he sacrificed for a lot of the success that he had. But it's not something I necessarily believe he had to sacrifice. Carr walked with Bryant towards the Lakers bus. So Derek Carr, his high school friend, this is after Kobe was drafted and was playing for the Lakers. And before they parted, they took a photo together. Bryant's loneliness seemed obvious, Carr said, looking back. It was the price he paid for that greatness. What I'm saying is greatness isn't easy to achieve. It requires a lot of time, a lot of sacrifices. It requires a lot of tough choices. It requires loved ones to sacrifice too. You have to have an understanding circle of family and friends. People don't always understand just how much effort from how many people goes into one person chasing a dream to be great. So, although Kobe's family was relatively well off, they still had to make sacrifices. His mom sacrificed to create structure in Kobe's life, to dote on him in a sense. His dad suffered in the sense that, they were running out of basketball money. He had to take on these different jobs. He coached at LaSalle, he coached at these other places, largely to give Kobe the best opportunity to succeed in basketball. And, his wife obviously suffered being in the public eye during a lot of the scandal and these types of things. So there's massive downside for the people around him. And the publicity is something that Kobe, I think, compared to other people, did a relatively good job of managing and adjusting, but it still probably could have been improved on. One thing that probably eats Kobe up the most is that his approach probably left some championships on the table. So if he got along better with Shaq, if he was able to adjust and work better with teammates, and his ego wasn't as much in play, he might have been able to win 1 or 2 more rings even. And both him and Shaq admit to this. ESPN broadcaster Stephen A. Smith would later tell a story that Shaquille O'Neal was at a Lakers game when Bryant summoned him to the locker room during the game to confess that it wasn't until he played with other centers that he came to realize he had failed to recognize O'Neal's greatness, that he regretted his failure and had cost them the opportunity to win more championships. Shaq came to a game. So, yes, that's from the Kobe side, but on the Shaq side, Shaq, when they had to sit down, they kind of agreed to the same thing. They both agreed that they probably could have had at least one more in them. Winter developed tremendous affinity for Bryant and admired so much about his unflinching dedication, but he also came to believe that Bryant's lack of college experience was ultimately the thing that kept him from the goal of being an unquestioned greatest of all time. So it's interesting to think about that as well, as he did forgo college. Would that have translated into, if he had gone to college, would he have learned skills that made him even more effective in the NBA? There's no way of saying that, but there is an opportunity cost of anything we do. And it's interesting to think about what the upside and downside are. I think he made the right decision going straight into the NBA, because any years he played in college would probably be years that he would take out of his NBA career and the experience there. But on the other hand, he sat most of his first season. And if he went and he played at Duke, for example, for the full season and got the reps in, maybe that would have added something, or he would have come into the NBA the next year and been able to start right away. So there is a back and forth, and there is a trade-off there. Something that George Mumford said is that you have to be somewhat narcissistic to be as good as those guys are. So if we skip back to that Shaq quote, ego is something that maybe prevented him from getting the last 1 or 2 rings, but that same ego is probably what got him the 5 rings. So it's really difficult to say if this was truly a negative consequence, but I'm certain there are things that he could have done that would have gotten him additional rings. The question is, would those extra rings have come at the cost of the previous rings, and what got him to there to begin with? The last part of this consequences of success are focused on physical deterioration. So Kobe practiced so much, but it wasn't necessarily always good for his body. He really did focus on recovery. I think he was one of the best at listening to his body, as we described in part 2. But of course, there are still consequences of putting all this work in. And maybe there are approaches he could have used to mitigate this. One of these possibly could have been getting more sleep. Obviously, a sign of the toll was his mounting injuries. He had so many over the years. He would soon strain his back operating a vacuum cleaner, of all things. But Bryant himself professed not to have time for injuries. There was a championship to be won, a legacy at stake. So again, it seems like he did treat his injuries relatively well. He did rehab, he did therapy, he did recovery every single day. But if you're putting in all this work over essentially, 35 years practicing basketball, well, maybe closer to 30 years practicing basketball every single day, there is bound to be a downside. Maybe something he could have done is approached using visualization more. He got very into this and meditation when he got to the NBA, but there's an opportunity earlier in his career, earlier in his high school career, that maybe he could have saved some extra bounce or his knees just a little bit more. He now found himself growing in the growing reality that he couldn't escape. Just as other greats had, Larry Bird had spent his later years in the NBA battling heel spurs and a bad back. The price he paid for all-out way he played. For Magic Johnson, the end had come with an embarrassing loss to Jordan and the Bulls in the 1991 NBA Finals game, followed a few months later by the stunning revelation that he was HIV positive. His later attempts to come back were hard to watch. So at the end of every athlete's career, they have to come to terms with the career they've had, and they have to realize that they physically cannot go on anymore. How soon that happens is a little bit up to us, a little bit up to, just the nature of the sport and the wear and tear. I mean, other sports, some of them have a longer window. For example, golf has a pretty long window. It seems like tennis is kind of the mid-range, and then football is probably the shortest window. Pro basketball's select few, its greatest competitors, had all reached the heights of fame and glory, only to find themselves staring at a harsh reality. Their youth was gone, having been spent in a seemingly endless, dizzying cycle of games and practices, a blur of physically challenging seasons, punctuated by summers that were far too brief and much too busy. They all spent the last few years of their careers trying to cheat time until finally realizing that their hour had come round at last. Now Bryant, in the midst of the Herculean task of trying to claim a back-to-back title, was getting the first glimpse of that reality. So you look back on your career, you do all this practice, all these things, and a lot of people might say, was it worth it? I think Kobe would say it was worth it, especially because he had a very fruitful and meaningful career after basketball with his family, with his production company, until it was tragically ended too soon. But I think a lot of great athletes look back and reminisce, and some of them might even regret all the hard work that they put in. They wish they had a family. You see this with entrepreneurs constantly. Entrepreneurship, starting a company is something that probably bleeds into your life over the course of your entire life more than even sports do, because you can only play sports for a certain amount of time. So that is a pitfall you kind of need to watch out for. I wanted to end this with one of my favorite quotes from Dear Basketball. And Kobe says, "My heart can take the pounding, my mind can handle the grind, but my body knows it's time to say goodbye." So he had to call it quits. There wasn't anything he could do at a certain point. His body had failed him when all these other forces he still had going for him. And it's funny to see that his body is the last thing that gave out. How Kobe of him, that his mind was still intact, ready to compete, ready to do these things, but his body is the thing that truly fails him. So, what can we learn from this? Can we make up for any of these advantages? We see what Kobe's parents has done. We saw the environment that he was in. If we're a parent, if we're a coach, how do we create these environments for the people we care about? If we're an individual, can we create some of these environments for ourselves? I think something we can definitely do is add some diversity in our learning. We can see how people all over the country, all over the world play their sports differently and learn from them. We can look at how we approach recovery and do as good a job as early as we can to do these types of things. Even for me, playing whatever sports I play, recovery has been very, very important as I've gotten into my 30s. And now I look back and say, wow, I wish I did a lot of this earlier. I don't think you can start with recovery. You can start with maintenance early enough. Even if you're a kid, start doing these things as quickly as possible. And from a cautionary tale perspective, what can we avoid? Is it possible to have a fruitful, successful athletic career? Is it possible to be the greatest of all time while maintaining a family life, while having friends, while doing these things? And that is something that I will hope to see as I do more and more of these studies. I would imagine Federer, I would imagine, for example, Steph Curry is someone who can balance a lot of these things. But many of the athletes we see, they have to sacrifice everything in pursuit of their goal. It is black and white for them. And as we go and we do more of these analyses, we'll start to get a better understanding of maybe who did that aspect of greatness better than anyone else. Again, this was part 3 of this series on Kobe Bryant. The next series, the next couple episodes will be interviews that I've done with people relating to some of the topics that we covered in this series. So they won't necessarily directly be about Kobe Bryant. Some of them might be, but they'll be on large topics that we covered, like mindfulness, like competition in the NBA and what NBA players are seeing in other great NBA players. I really enjoyed bringing this to you. Hopefully you found it valuable. The best possible thing you can do if you enjoy this podcast and you want to help it grow is to share this with someone who you think might enjoy it. It could either be a Kobe fan, or someone who likes sports, or someone who simply wants to pursue excellence and learn from these great athletes. I have included all of the show notes, all of the links to the resources I used in the show notes. The 3 main books I read were this one, The Mamba Mentality, a book called Showboat, and a book called The Rise. And then I have 20 YouTube links and a couple different podcasts that I listen to. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next one. The next series like this, the next Anatomy of Excellence, will be on Tiger Woods.